Good day. This is Bashir Mundi, and this is the presentation of my paper, which is still a work in progress, on Jihad and Islamic social reform movement in Nigeria. My paper will be looking at the development of the concept and practice of jihad through the lens of Islamic scholars, interpretation of Islamic scholars, particularly Islamic scholars that have been influential in West Africa. So these will include scholars of North Africa, but whose influence has been in West Africa. I'm particularly looking at the schools of thought as well, which is primarily the Maliki school of thought. Then I will also be looking at some of the formation of the views on jihad by more contemporary Islamic movements and some scholars. And then I will be looking at the some of the narratives or counter narratives to what manifested in what is called the Boko Haram, which is an organization, Jama'atu 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 Ahlus Sunnah Dawati wal Jihad, the people or the group of the organization or the group for of based on the tradition of the Prophet for propagation of Islam and for waging jihad. This is a group popularly known as Boko Haram, and who is an extremist Islamic violent extremist group that has been leading an uprising against the Nigerian government in violent military engagement for over a decade now, with tens of thousands of people killed as a result. Nigeria, of course, is situated in West Africa, and it has had quite some Islamic history dated more strongly from the 12th century, from the 12th century. So I want to begin by looking at first some of the understanding of jihad or the concept of jihad from Islamic sources, primarily the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. In the Quran, the term jihad is normally used broadly to refer to different aspects of struggle, which is the linguistic meaning of the word jihad is struggle or to exert oneself. So in different parts of the jihad of the Quran, jihad refers to a struggle or for one to be dedicated in God. The Quran talks about those who do jihad in us, as in those who do jihad in the ways or the paths of God. The terminology that the Quran uses specifically for military warfare are two in the Quran. The first is qital, which implies a military engagement. In other words, there are two parties or self-defense. And then the second is the word harb, which is the Arabic word equivalent to the English word war. And this is also used in the Quran. In the Quran, chapter 2, verse 190, we see qital being used to refer to self-defense. Fight against those who fight against you, but do not be the aggressor, for God does not love the aggressor. We also see that in chapter 49, verse 9 of the Quran, it refers to again waging qital, and this time the waging of qital or warfare by one Muslim group against another Muslim group that is seen as being oppressive or unjust. We see now in the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, he speaks about jihad meaning different things, and describing jihad, for example, as the act of speaking truth to an unjust ruler, even if one loses their life. He also describes jihad as a hajj that is performed excellently as a jihad of women. When his wife Aisha asked him, "Oh, the men go out for warfare. What about us, the women?" And he said that, well, your hajj is your jihad. He also mentions jihad as meaning serving one's parent. When a young person came to him, a young man came to him and said, "Oh, I want to go out for military, for military expedition like the older companions." And the Prophet asks him, "Do you have parents that are alive?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Well, then go and do jihad in your parents, go and serve your parents, and that is your jihad." But Muslim jurists have technically used the term jihad really to mean qital, to mean, engaging in military warfare. And this is seen in the titles that they give chapters on war in books of Islamic jurisprudence. And Muslim jurists also developed the concept of Darul Harb and Darul Islam, or the abode of war and the abode of Islam. The abode of Islam being the territories controlled by Muslims, and the abode of war basically being any other territories. But again, these are not Quranic or Hadithic concepts. These are juristic concepts of Islamic jurists. And so these have been debated over the ages, with some jurists saying no, places that are not controlled by by Muslims does not necessarily mean that they're abodes of war. It could be Darul Sulh, an abode of a treaty, or Darul Dawah, an abode where we're free to propagate Islam and so forth. And these have been debated by the different schools of thought. Now, coming to the Islamic scholars and their influence in West Africa with regards to the concept of jihad, I will begin by mentioning Muhammad bin Abdul Karim al Maghili, who was an Algerian scholar who died in 1505, but was very, very influential in West Africa. Some of his travels in his earlier years and his travels to Fez and his understanding of the Spanish Inquisition and the Spanish Reconquista, of the late 15th century, uh, helped to shape his very antagonistic view of dhimmis, or people who are non-Muslim citizens of Islamic states. And this led him really to instigate an uprising against the Jews of Tamantit, which is in south central Algeria, destroying their synagogue and driving them out of the place. But of course, some of these views, his very antagonistic views and very intolerant views, were opposed by other Muslim scholars, and ultimately he was basically forced to have to leave Algeria. And he eventually settled, he came to Kano, which is the most ancient city in northern Nigeria, and he met with and became a guest of the king of Kano at the time, Muhammad Rumfa, and became an advisor to the court. And he used this position to basically form policies of this kingdom. And some of his policies existed even in the forms of books that he actually wrote for the implementation of rule. He wrote a book titled Tajuddin fi Tajuddin fi فيما يجب على الملوك. In other words, the crown of the religion in what is the obligation of kings. And he again continued with very, very anti-Muslim, and very strong views against Muslims. And he also introduced the idea that he was the mujaddid, or the reformer or renewer of the faith for that century. And he also introduced the idea that he also introduced the idea of Muslims fighting against other Muslims, which was strange to the West Africans at the time. He later on became advisor to Muhammad Askia, who was the king then of Songhai in the city of Gao, where he also propagated these views. So you can see, and he was very influential, though from North Africa, but he settled in West Africa. We will now look at Sheikh Umar Tal. Also, I mentioned Umar Tal. He is from Senegambia, and he also waged jihad. And he had a view, actually, even though he was primarily Maliki, of the Maliki school of thought of Islamic jurisprudence, but he gave less emphasis on following a school of thought. And he actively engaged in jihad and conquering lands, and he ruled over an empire that was short-lived and basically was toppled by the French when the French came in and in their colonization project. I will mention also I'll mention the Fulani scholar Usman Danfodio, whose Sokoto Jihad basically lasted for about 100 years, from around 1804 to around 1904, where they were toppled also by the British. Now, Usman Dan Fodio's jihad basically started as an uprising against Muslim rulers of Hausa states that he considered to be practicing or engaging in syncretic practices alongside with their Islamic religious beliefs. So his jihad was a jihad, a reformative jihad, and he waged his jihad, and it was primarily against other Muslim states. And so his jihad, actually his ideology was opposed by another scholar that I'll mention here, whose views was influential, Muhammad al-Amin al-Kanami, who also was an influential scholar in the Borno Empire to the east, which is an older empire. 800 years the Muslims had been there before the Sokoto Jihad. And he opposed Osman Dan Fodio's jihads both through resisting militarily as well as polemical letters that he would send correspondence and they will exchange between them. So, but the Borno Empire, which he was a representative of, had also fought jihads in the past of expansion and forced conversion actually to Islam. Now, moving more to more contemporary times, mentioned a group called the Jamaatul Izalatul Bid'ah wa Iqamat Sunnah, which is a group basically that was formed to reform Muslim society based on more puritanical, literalistic views of Islam. And then you had another organization called the Islamic Movement of Nigeria, IMN, which is a Shiite organization actually that was inspired into formation by the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And they propagated views like saying that the state is a kufr state, it's a state of disbelief, and they propagated views against Western education. They did not get violent with government, but they were at various times members and leaders being arrested by the state. Later on, we have also the organization, which is the key organization in question here, the Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah al-Da'wati wal Jihad, or popularly known as Boko Haram, which is a Hausa terminology implying the abomination or the forbiddance of modern or Western education. And of course, this organization or this movement was founded by Muhammad Yusuf, who was a very charismatic leader, but not very well schooled in the traditional Islamic sciences. However, in terms of theology, in terms of his theology, and in large part in terms of his views about jihad, his views were very much in the same line of what will be termed Salafi or Wahhabist jihadist ideology. Except that, of course, they turned violent, and then we find that this is the same case with many of such groups around the world, whether it is Al Shabaab or whether it be ISIS, etc. In terms of their theology, they tend to basically be Salafist, or what is called Salafist or Wahhabist, more strict interpretation or rigid interpretation of Islam. So, in this guise, there have been scholars in Nigeria that have engaged with this organization in polemics and debate and refutation. And among these scholars, I'll mention just a few who happen to also be considered by members of the Boko Haram as having been their own mentors or their own teachers at some point or the other. One of such scholars was Sheikh Mahmoud Jafar Adam, who was assassinated in 2007. It was later on discovered that those who carried out the assassination were members of the Boko Haram. And the leader of the Boko Haram was actually one time a student of Sheikh Mahmoud Jafar. Sheikh Mahmoud Jafar was a Saudi-trained scholar, and he opposed their views about Western education and about government being illegitimate or taghut, being an illegitimate government, and anything that propagated, any institution that upheld and allowed such a government or system to be sustained was also haram. So Boko Haram or Western education or modern education was considered by them to be haram. You also have another scholar by the name of Sheikh Muhammad Adam al-Albani of Zaria, popularly known as Albani Zaria, who had a lot of debates also with them, refuting their ideology. But these groups and these scholars agreed with them on terms of theology. He was also assassinated around 2014 or 2014. He was assassinated. And then we've had other scholars such as Ibrahim Isa Ibrahim Pantami, who did a lot of debates, actually video recorded debates with the lead, the founder of the Boko Haram movement. The last, which I will conclude with, is the activity of the Dawa Institute of Nigeria, which is an arm of the Islamic Education Trust, which was established as an organization to help sustain and promote and support Islamic education and moral reform in Nigeria, founded in 1969. And the Dawa Institute, which is an institute under this organization, actually engages in combating these sorts of extremist ideology by propagating what it considers to be a more balanced view of Islam, as in the form of production of literature, books, training manuals that deal with topics such as jihad and the history of jihad, such as relationship or relations with non-Muslims, such as different gender issues about women's dressing, about polygamy, about uh, 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 circumcision, both male and female circumcision, about issues to do with Sharia law and the inheritance law, whether they're fair to women or not, and whether punishments in Sharia are too harsh, and so on and so forth. So they organize trainings and they produce manuals and literature. And part of their strategy also is the literature distribution to targeted influencers such as scholars, such as student activists, as well as to the general public, and also translating a lot of this material into the local languages and production of content on video and audio in English as well as in the various local languages. And it is their objective that flooding the airwaves as well as the intellectual libraries with counter narratives will help to combat the kind of extremist ideology that we find in Boko Haram. And so that is a synoptic presentation based on my research writing on the Jihad and Islamic social reform movements in Nigeria. Thank you for your time.